Welcome back to the History Fix. Today we're going to talk about the peculiarity of Europe. We've already started to talk about the way in which Europe in the late medieval period begins to forge ahead of the rest of the world, developing a new kind of society which will develop into capitalism, and capitalism will eventually come to dominate the world. Now, there's a question, before we get too much further along with that story, a question about why this should happen, why capitalism should develop in Europe rather than anywhere else. And at first it seems strange because if you think about those great civilizations of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age in antiquity, the great centers of civilization were actually not in Europe. Europe was actually marginal to the great Bronze Age civilizations in the river valleys of Egypt and the Middle East and China and what is now Pakistan. Even in the Iron Age, the civilizations that were based on the ancient Greek city-states and then the Roman Empire, they were very much centered on the Mediterranean rather than the heartland of Europe. So at first it seems strange that Europe should become so important in the early modern period. And it's a particular part of Europe too, a very marginal part up until now in world history, northwestern Europe. So we're going to focus a bit on geography today to try and get an idea why Europe has this distinctive history. And in the next one or two episodes of the History Fix, we'll move the focus and try and talk about why, in comparison, Africa and Asia don't develop capitalism in the same way. But today the focus is on Europe. And the first thing I want to say about it is this. The European continent has got a very strange configuration. It consists of a series of fingers and fists of land sticking out into the sea. Europe has an exceptionally long coastline, 37,000 kilometers of coastline, which is the equivalent of the circumference of the Earth. So pretty well everybody living in Europe isn't that far from the sea. The Europeans have always been very focused on the sea, on maritime trade, therefore on wider connections with the outside world, a little bit like the way Socrates talked about the Greeks. He said the Greeks were like frogs around a pond. The same could be said of the Europeans as a whole. What's also true about Europe is that it is connected with the great Eurasian landmass stretching all the way across Russia to the Pacific. There are great waves of movements of people and goods and ideas throughout antiquity, throughout the medieval period, moving across the Eurasian landmass, and there are no real barriers to that movement. So you get people able to move all the way from the Ural Mountains of Russia, right the way across the North European plain, as far as Paris and beyond to the Atlantic. You've got another channel of communication, the Middle European Corridor that runs from the steppes of southern Russia, across the Carpathian passes, across the Hungarian plain, and again through into France and the Atlantic. These great east-west Eurasian routeways, which means that we've got tremendous amounts of interaction and communication and stuff and people moving around. North-south communication in Europe is also relatively easy. There are mountains, but the mountains are relatively low mountains with mountain passes, so the movement is possible, and also there are great river systems as well, dissecting Europe and again making movement relatively easy. So one major thing about Europe's geography is the way in which it is connected with other places by the sea lanes and also by these great routeways which stretch across the Eurasian landmass. It's a place of connection, a place of interaction. Now, there's another major factor to do with Europe's geography that to some degree cuts against that observation. And it is that Europe tends to divide up into separate units, separate geographical units, separate economic and social units, and separate political units. Throughout its history, this has been the case. It's been very rare in history for the Europeans to be united in a single megapolity, in a single great big empire. There have been certain attempts in history to achieve this, and generally speaking, they have failed. And I think that's probably mainly to do again with the geography of Europe. Europe has a relatively moderate climate. The moderating influence is largely due to the Gulf Stream, which runs up the western, northern and eastern sides of the Atlantic. It brings warm water, warm air, and that has a moderating effect on the climate of Europe. Europe is divided by those modest mountain ranges and rivers, and it's also divided by the fact that there is sea around so much of it, sea around those fingers and those fists of land that I was talking about a moment or two ago. What does that mean? It means we've got a series of relatively distinct and separate ecological zones within Europe. Europe varies from the tundra of the far north through the cold forests, the taiga forests a little bit further south, then comes into relatively moderate deciduous woodland that supports, when the woodland has been cleared, supports lots of agriculture, down to the Mediterranean littoral, where again you have a different kind of ecosystem and a different kind of agriculture developing there. And then those mountains and those rivers and those seas surrounding the different chunks of the European landmass, what they tend to mean is that you get distinctive cultures, languages, religious groups, ethnic groups, and so on, developing in different parts of Europe. It's still the case today, as a kind of measure of that distinctive geography, that there are 26 major languages spoken in Europe. So although the Europeans have been open to outside influence, connected to the Eurasian landmass, connected by the sea to the wider world, at the same time, Europe itself internally has tended to be divided into a whole series of relatively small, petty states. Europe traditionally is a continent of warring states. Put these two things together and you have something quite distinctive. You have a place open to outside influence, a place interacting with the wider world, a place where there's movement of people and goods and ideas, and at the same time you have the Europeans divided into competing petty states, competing tribes, and nowadays, or latterly, of course, competing nation states. Now, if you're in a divided world, if you're in a world where you are competing with your near neighbours, there is a premium placed upon innovation, on change, a willingness to adapt, a willingness to abandon a conservative way of organising your economy or your society or your political system, a willingness to embrace the new ideas that will give you an advantage over the neighbours who are your rivals, with whom you are competing in this continent of warring states. Put it all together, and you have in Europe a very distinctive geography, which in the 15th and the 16th century creates the possibility of a takeoff to a new kind of economy based on commercial capitalism, driven by the middling sort, driven by a class of improving gentry and yeoman peasants and ship owners and merchants and urban artisans and traders and so on. Very much in contrast to the situation in other parts of the world, in the Americas, in Africa and in Asia. And we'll talk about why those societies were so different and eventually came to be dominated by the Europeans in the next couple of issues of the History Fix. That's all for now. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at the History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe, and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.